be willing and intervene in Syria with or without United Nations approval. Okay, my beloved brothers and sisters, let's start. Is Manchester United versus Liverpool? Did I say something wrong? I'm not going to mention Manchester City. Can we have the Prime Minister to take the floor?
Can you all hear me? Ladies and gentlemen, the atrocities in Syria are beyond the imagination of anybody sitting in this room. Assad has turned the military and the regime against the very people of his state. He is turning his armored tanks against innocent villagers, men, women and children. These atrocities have gone on for too long. The international community has done nothing but pay lip service to the kind of atrocities that have gone on. Side government thinks that something needs to be done and something needs to be done urgently. In my speech today, I'm going to do a couple of things. I'm first going to lay out the model that we propose and then going to look at a couple of key questions. Why aren't current methods working? Why does Assad need to go? Why will our intervention work? Third, why won't any other methods proposed work? And lastly, why is it the prerogative of the international community to intervene? Let's dive straight away into the model. We have a couple of prongs that I want to explain here. First, the international community and the coalition of the willing must prioritize surgical strikes. So the NATO, the Arab League, Turkey, Qatar and any other country that is willing to intervene and put forces on the ground. Neutralized tanks, and you must neutralize the armed convoy that Assad so well uses to go against his own people. Because it's not possible for them to defend against the combined military expertise that NATO, the West, or Qatar and Turkey or the Arab League possess. The second thing, you must set up a buffer zone for Syria, for people of escaping at the Syria-Turkey border, which means you must facilitate refugees, you must set up missions for humanitarian aid. This is the buffer zone where you train the rebels who want to be trained, but if they aren't enough, then we are ready to put our own soldiers on the ground, which is the second option, not the most preferred one. The third thing, preferably you capture a member of the regime and you train your soldiers to do that. You capture those who have done these atrocities against them, but if push comes to shove, we are okay with killing the members of this regime because we think they absolutely must go. There is no other alternative in place. Last, if you feel the need, we think you can put UN observers on the ground for post-conflict scenarios in order to establish some sort of working democracy, in order to establish systems that work within this place. But lastly, we also want to set up a national transition council like happened in Libya, which can comprise of members of different communities and ethnicities, which can also have members of the Alawite community, those who have not been part of the regime. So the model is pretty clear. Our stance is this. He has been given enough ways in which to redeem himself. He hasn't shown any positive measures in stopping the kind of atrocities that he has gone on with. We think if he does not go immediately, innocents will continue to die. He must go. Have a seat, sir. So let's look at this. Why aren't current methods working? Because we have tried absolutely everything that we could at this point in time, which means sanctions have been tried, UN envoys have been sent, Arab League observers have been sent, Kofi Annan has himself gone to that place, but he hasn't stopped. What are the kinds of things he has done? Simple eyewash, which means he has promised you he'll stop, but just yesterday in Howrah, 50 innocent children were found dead. We think that's the sort of atrocities that he's willing to engage in. But more than that, initially we were ready to negotiate with him, but right now he shows no signs of making any progress with international community or with observers who go there. Assad knows that he has enough money stashed overseas to carry on the kind of conflict that he needs to carry on. And that is why he is confident of his abilities to carry on the repression that goes on some status quo. Which means if no change is made, this repression will simply wipe out the resistance movement that we see in Syria today. We think that's why international intervention at this point is an absolute must. Let's look at the second point that I want to bring to you. Why will our intervention work? Very first and simple point, because we have better equipment than what Assad possesses in status quo. And I look at this at two levels. Because there are two main suppliers of weapons to Assad today. First, Iran. And Iran simply does not have the kind of weapons expertise that other countries that are willing to engage in this kind of coalition possess. So that's neutralized. But secondly, Russia provides him weapons. And Russia does not want or will not want to provide their A-grade weapons because there's a danger of the Syrian army developing on them or using on them. Which means Russia will only provide their second-hand weapons or their old weapons. We think we have enough to neutralize that. But the second argument is this, that given that there will be some kind of progress made, defections are what we will likely see. Which means the kind of minorities that exist in the army who are not Alawite, do not have some sort of ideological connection with Assad, do not have some sort of long-binding commitment. Which means once we start to have defections is when the army and the very structure that Assad holds dear to the kind of repression that he does will crumble in the first place. We think that is how we make progress under our side of the house. Before we move on, sir.
I think this motion demands that you give us a concrete list of nations which you think will participate in this, and you can't just say, in general, NATO, in general, the UN will agree.
So I trusted side opposition to know which countries are part of the NATO, but I also told you countries like Arab League, countries like Qatar and Turkey, who have showed the willingness to go against Assad and to send their envoys to Canada. Let's move on. Why don't other methods work? And I'm going to look at 3 methods that could possibly but do not work. First, sanctions. A, they have been imposed for too long, but he hasn't shown anything. And B, the reason that they haven't worked is because he knows he has enough oil money stashed away overseas to carry on the kind of repression that he has carried on. Which means he knows that if no one intervenes in the next few months, it's simple for him to wipe the resistance movement out. What's the second alternative? Offering him amnesty. Even that doesn't work. Because he is confident in his ability to wipe out the resistance movement, and offering amnesty has the danger of him being tried later on. And that is why he won't accept amnesty as well. But a third method is waiting for UN approval and waiting indefinitely, carrying on the kind of backdoor diplomacy that we would ideally have liked. But that doesn't work, because there's very little cost to Russia of continuing with status quo. It's rather they who gain money from selling weapons to Assad in the first place. Second, they're also well versed in the art of this kind of diplomatic pressure that the West or other countries might put on them. Which means there's no incentive for Russia to back down on status quo and have some sort of larger coalition in place. We think then, even without the UN having some sort of consensus, we need to intervene in this scenario. Let's move on to my last point. Why do we think then the international community has a responsibility? The argument is the responsibility to protect. Because we think Assad has completely lost any claims that he can make to sovereignty. Because sovereignty only exists when a leader has the best intentions of his people in mind when he makes those policies. And Assad clearly does not have that when he turns his tanks against the peoples, when he raises down villages for no good rational reason. We think then he has lost the claim to sovereignty. But he has also lost legitimacy as a popular leader, because the people don't want him anymore. You see the kind of news that floats around, the kinds of videos where people demand the West to take up some action and to protect their very homes, to protect their lives and to protect their children. Which means in terms of sovereignty and in terms of his claim to having some sort of responsible leadership, he does not have that. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the time to intervene. This is the time to save innocent lives, innocent children. Very proud to propose.
Mr. Chair, we don't contest the idea that the situation in Syria is indeed regrettable, because we recognize that it's pretty horrible and unhumane down there. But we don't think that now is the right time to intervene, but we won't rule it out in the future. We think this debate takes place in the now, where we're talking about what we already know and what we can possibly foresee. Therefore, we think, given the current climate, we don't think intervention in Syria is a strategic move for the international community. We think we're going to stick with current efforts of diplomacy. We're going to stick with talks, we're going to stick with negotiations, we're going to stick with peacekeeping efforts, but we don't think that the international community can go in and instigate military action against the Assad regime. Before I go on, a few rebuttals for the previous speaker. The first thing he tells us is that let's attack his proposal. Because the first thing he says, that the international community has overwhelming military might. But the first response is that military might is never just a justification or even a reasonable assumption for you to win a war. We've had people win wars with much cruder weapons, like in Vietnam, due to overwhelming numbers or due to natural advantages. Because we think that's exactly the problem here in Syria, where a lot of the fighting is concentrated in the urban centers. Places where the Assad regime knows best, and places where you have the highest likelihood of civilian casualties. And we don't think it's a responsible move for us to say it's okay to kill people on the ground. Second, they tell us that they're going to facilitate refugees at different borders. But they never proved to us that these Arab League nations are going to be willing to accept a massive exodus of people that they have to feed and clothe and protect into their lands. We think that's something that has to fly in their model. And I'm going to prove to you that these people obviously don't want that. Third thing, he tells us we're going to have UN peacekeepers. But this only works in the scenario where they have UN approval. They have to prove to us that if the UN says we don't care about your coalition, they have efforts to make sure that they can address that. Thirdly, he tells us that Assad can't rely on Iranian help anyway. We've already told you that with or without help from other countries, they already have distinct advantages and possess massive risks of collateral harm, something that any responsible actor in the international community would not risk having. Next, he told us that we're going to have defectors if we see that we're going to engage in Assad's regime with international intervention. But we tell you defectors are more likely to happen on our side. Why? We think intervention radicalizes people. We think intervention will cause more people to take up arms. These people may not necessarily be pro-Assad, but they're definitely going to be against anti-intervention, causing more people to take up arms and cause more conflict against Western troops and against civilians on the ground. But secondly, we think that when you ask people that you have to sit down and talk about these things, you make them rethink whether or not this war or this oppression that they're waging is actually worth it. So we think we actually give a better incentive for people to defect, a better incentive for people to comply with peace efforts. I'm going to argue three things to you today. First, on why war in the current context is not going to work. Second, why the coalition of the willing is virtually non-existent. Nobody is going to fight this war. And lastly, why diplomacy is the effort that we're most willing to take and why it's one that's most viable. On the first idea, why war is not going to work. But before I go on, sure.
Given that he has billions of oil dollars stashed away, what incentive does Assad have to back down?
We think, for example, that human rights violations have been committed in China, which has the largest economy in the world. Lots of resources, right? But the point is, even if they're rich, over time you can get them to make concessions, like stop killing journalists, like open your markets to other countries. So we think diplomacy is reasonable. Let's weigh this later on in my third argument. Three reasons why war is not going to work. The first reason is because you can't compare this exactly to Libya. What we had in Libya were a lot of skirmishes and wars fought away from the urban centers in military strongholds in the wastelands and in the provinces. We don't think that you can have this in Syria, especially when the battlegrounds are places like Damascus and Homs where you have a high civilian concentration. And we don't think you can simply isolate the fighting there. We think it's important to consider these things because the just war theory states that one of the reasons why you go into war is you have a high reasonable probability of success. We don't think you can call it a success if you're going to have thousands of people in collateral dead at the end of the day. Second reason, we don't think we can intervene without a unified opposition. Why exactly is this important? We think we need important figures and bureaucrats to be able to take over once you settle down. So we're going to argue in a post-war scenario, something which they've never proven to us is actually going to materialize. We tell you that we have a lot, the Syrian opposition is factious. You have the Syrian Free Army, you have the Syrian National Council, you have the Syrian Transitory Council. Why is this important? Because we think they have different extents on whether or not they're willing to accept intervention, different extents as to how they foresee a particular government, and we think that without resolving these things internally, even if you do come in and intervene, you're going to have three new powers that are going to be fighting over the vacuum there, so what you're actually doing is making the war worse on the ground. But thirdly, even if there is a unified opposition, we think that because of its sectarian nature, these people are not going to perceive it as illegitimate. We think that a lot of these groups gain a lot of credibility from their home sects in Saudi Arabia. And whenever you prop them out officially, assuming you get the Arab League to come in, we don't think it's going to be seen as a legitimate government. It's going to be seen as an effort by the Arab League to further control and manipulate their lives. And we don't think that opposition is going to last very long. But thirdly, let's talk about geography. We think one of the biggest factors that limited the refugee exodus in Libya is that a large part of it was facing the Mediterranean Sea, right? But when you're talking about Syria, it's landlocked with countries like Turkey, Lebanon, Iraq, and Israel. And we think a protracted war is going to cause a massive exodus into these countries. They have to prove to us that these people are going to risk this war, with the possibility of accepting thousands and thousands of people flooding their borders, taking away security from their people, giving them more reasons as to their people questioning as to whether or not these people deserve protection in the first place. And we think more likely than not, these governments are going to side on the side of their people, telling them that we owe you our responsibility to protect you first, and we don't think we owe these refugees anything. But finally, why are we willing to go with diplomacy? We think diplomacy is a long-term effort, which is why you have a multi-year plan coming from Kofi Annan. But we think in the past, we've always had a high threshold for abandoning diplomacy, right? And we think if we throw it away right now, after 1 year after the Arab Spring, we think we're doing it a massive disservice. Because we think sanctions do work, and concessions do come from abusive governments. We've seen China relax its policies, we've seen Myanmar release Aung San Suu Kyi and actually hold free elections, and even if it came grudgingly from the military junta. What does this tell you? We think you can get diplomacy to get people to change. And from the opposition side, we prefer a few hundred deaths and some concessions over a decade or two, because we can't say that these regimes are absolutely going to stop. We think maybe the atrocities will still continue, but we think without antagonizing them, they happen on a much smaller scale. Whereas what they're proposing is that you throw away diplomacy, even though you've never really given it a chance, make military intervention your first option, and have 100,000 dead people on your hands just because you were impatient for things to work, just because you wanted to come in and prove that you're right. We don't think this is a battle of who has the bigger stake. It's about a battle of seeing whether or not you can reasonably convince a military junta to put down its arms. And we think you best do that when you feed them diplomacy, and that's what you get from the opposition side. Thanks.
He was right in saying that diplomacy is a long-term effort. What he needed to justify then is why is it right for us to wait so long when people are being shelled by tanks, ladies and gentlemen, when there's aerial bombardments of cities going on, ladies and gentlemen, when yesterday 59 kids innocently were hit by shells by the military army of Syria, ladies and gentlemen. They needed to tell us why it's justified to wait so long. But more importantly, right, he never rebutted Rohit's analysis as to how this person has no incentive to give in to diplomatic pressure, ladies and gentlemen. Extensive analysis came from Rohit to you that he has absolutely no incentive to make any concession whatsoever, ladies and gentlemen, because he knows without international military intervention, he will be able to repress this uprising in a matter of years, ladies and gentlemen. He has enough money stored outside to necessarily last that long. So we don't think diplomatic pressures will work, ladies and gentlemen. They need to give us more analysis on that end, ladies and gentlemen. But more importantly, right, a quick housekeeping issue before I move on to my issues. He said, well, if you're talking about peacekeeping, when there's no UN consensus, how will you do peacekeeping? We think peacekeeping happens post-conflict. We see no incentive for Russia post-conflict to drop any measures to stabilize Syria itself, ladies and gentlemen. So we think that point is moot. Let's talk about my few rebuttals towards them. First, about urban warfare. We think on the first level, ladies and gentlemen, when you take out high importance targets like tanks, like armored vehicles, like airfields, ladies and gentlemen, their ability to cause collateral damage towards Syria reduces. But more importantly, ladies and gentlemen, we said that we are using the FSA to carry out this, which means, ladies and gentlemen, they are understanding the terrain of the cities. We think, ladies and gentlemen, they will be able to do just fine. More importantly, we have done well in urban warfare in the past. In Iraq, for instance, ladies and gentlemen, we were able to minimize casualties to a very large extent, ladies and gentlemen, in the process of carrying out urban warfare. But lastly, we think, ladies and gentlemen, the moment we start enticing defections from the army, the sort of resistance that we will face will also rapidly go down. Rohit gave you the incentives for defections that exist under our paradigm, ladies and gentlemen. We said that the Sunni majority army has no ideological allegiance to Bashar al-Assad. They don't want to kill their own Sunni brothers. The only reason they do so is because in status quo they are scared. Because they are scared of the repercussions that will fall upon their family, ladies and gentlemen, if this uprising is unsuccessful, and all trends in status quo points towards the uprising being unsuccessful. So we think, ladies and gentlemen, that the whole our whole point about defectors stands, ladies and gentlemen. They haven't proven why they will not be more defectors. The next issue, ladies and gentlemen, was about the civilian casualties. We said, ladies and gentlemen, that on the first level we are going to be able to minimize them. That's what we've seen in past trends. But we think some amount is inevitable. You need to prove how you will ensure in less number of people dying when Bashar al-Assad has people bombing cities, ladies and gentlemen, on a daily basis. That's the fundamental event on both sides. Let's talk about the two things I'll bring to you. For the first time, ladies and gentlemen, I talked to you about the post-conflict scenario within Syria. Before that, yes.
Can you really sustain a protracted war when 3 weeks into the Libyan conflict, NATO ran out of bullets and the US isn't willing to risk another debacle like Iraq, and while they abandoned virtually any kind of nation building in Libya right now?
Ladies and gentlemen, we don't think that's true. We think NATO has sufficient capability to carry out a protracted war, but we don't think this war will last long anyway. We think the moment we take out the high-profile targets like airfields, like anti-tanks and armored vehicles, we think people will begin defending, ladies and gentlemen. We have seen signs of that. That's where the Free Syrian Army came into existence in the first place. We think that, ladies and gentlemen, this won't be a very long-term operation. Even if it is, we think the global community together has the capability. Let's talk about the post-conflict scenario and why we are better. On the first level, ladies and gentlemen, we think we are the people who empower them, given that most of the tasks of carrying out this resistance against Assad is handed out to people like the Free Syrian Army in our paradigm. We think, ladies and gentlemen, we are the people who necessarily give the people on the ground ownership of this rebellion, ladies and gentlemen. And moreover, we think it's people on the ground who are asking for international aid, ladies and gentlemen, in the form of surgical strikes against Bashar al-Assad. We think under our paradigm, ladies and gentlemen, the sort of ownership that these people have is much greater. But secondly, see, timely international support makes people more malleable to the international community, ladies and gentlemen. When they see that the international community is willing to stand up to these people and stand up for these people, ladies and gentlemen, we think these people are more likely to then see the international community more favorably, ladies and gentlemen. They're more likely to be amenable to the sort of pressures put by the international community later on. We think then, ladies and gentlemen, the National Transition Council of Syria, for instance, who is currently united, we think under our paradigm we are going to strengthen it by taking people from the minority Alawite community as well, so as to put forward a united and uniform front to the people of Syria. We think, ladies and gentlemen, when the NTC sees that the international community has come on time and helped them, we think they're more likely to be malleable to the sort of reforms we suggested them. They're more likely to cooperate with the international community a lot more. That's much better under our paradigm, ladies and gentlemen. But lastly, ladies and gentlemen, we told you about the minorities itself. We think first and foremost under our model, given the fact that we created NTC that reflects the demographics of Syria, we think minorities will be protected better under our paradigm, as opposed to letting this be, ladies and gentlemen, where the resentment towards the minority increases. Because as Bashar al-Assad continues to carry out atrocities on its people, ladies and gentlemen, that's where the resentment against the Alawite community increases massively within Syria, ladies and gentlemen. That's what makes it extremely difficult for these divides to later on recede, ladies and gentlemen. We think then under our paradigm, we make it much, much better. But more than that, ladies and gentlemen, we think it's under our paradigm in terms of refugees, right? We think on the first level, because the conflict goes on for much lesser, because they've said that diplomacy is a long-term process, we think the number of refugees will be much, much greater in that process, ladies and gentlemen, as more and more people continue to get caught. So we think it's under our paradigm that we minimize the number of refugees. But what about the number of refugees that will exist in both number of paradigms? We think, ladies and gentlemen, Turkey has already expressed interest in letting these refugees in and in taking care of these refugees. They're doing it in status quo, ladies and gentlemen. But lastly, once we have an internationally coordinated effort, we have international funding to take care of these refugees, not Turkish funding, ladies and gentlemen. So we think there's greater incentive for people to go ahead and take them in. We think it's under our paradigm, ladies and gentlemen, that the number of refugees will be lesser because this conflict will end soon. Because they haven't shown, ladies and gentlemen, what's the timeline for this conflict ending under their paradigm. We think it's under their paradigm that this conflict goes on and on for years and years, ladies and gentlemen. Specifically, right, of the analysis over review, which they never once rebutted. We think that under our paradigm, ladies and gentlemen, we do much, much better for the post-conflict scenario in terms of their love towards the minority communities or in terms of the number of refugees that are created, ladies and gentlemen. We think we are superior. On the last aspect, ladies and gentlemen, as to what are the incentives of the international community, because that's the fundamental thing you need to recognize, ladies and gentlemen. Because we think on the first level, countries like Iran, for instance, aren't likely to intervene anymore, ladies and gentlemen, because they recognize on the first level that once we have an armed international intervention of abroad, most countries will back off. So countries like Russia, China and Iran will back off the moment there's an international armed intervention for a couple of reasons. Because they cannot afford open conflict. Because when you analyze the incentives of each of these countries, a country like Iran is already in a lot of trouble, ladies and gentlemen, with their nuclear program. They're already trying to negotiate with the international community. So the moment they see international armed presence in this region, they're going to back off. When you talk about Russia and China, ladies and gentlemen, these are countries that lose nothing in possible diplomatic stagnation in the UN, but they lose a lot if they go into an armed conflict, ladies and gentlemen. When you talk about China in the midst of a regime change, they cannot afford a sort of proxy war in this area. When you talk about Russia, who's just struggling with the poor economy, ladies and gentlemen, and also struggling with regime change issues, ladies and gentlemen, will also protest against Vladimir Putin. We think these countries will automatically back out, which means, ladies and gentlemen, we think we have a better chance of necessarily intervening successfully in Syria. We've proven to you, ladies and gentlemen, how in the long term we do much better in post-conflict scenario, how in the short term we stop the conflict. NTU A is extremely proud to propose.
ask us is, why is it justified to wait? And I think the answer is very simple to everyone who has lived in a country where war actually happened. The idea that war in itself is an intrinsic evil. The idea in itself, Mr. Speaker, that when people are fighting and you have no escape, not because your state doesn't want to protect you, but even the people who are trying to protect you are the very same people who could be killing you. There are a number of things I want to talk about to the previous speaker. Firstly, they say that there are no trends by which we can say that there are actual changes going on. I want to give you 3 trends that's happened only recently in 2011. Firstly, we think there was a rebirth of free market capitalism when in Syria they reopened things such as casinos, multinational corporations and such. Second, state of emergency, which is something we would consider a massive development as far as the rights of the government are concerned. We think they've lowered a lot of barriers of the people on the ground as far as democracy is concerned, and they've lowered a lot of power struggle and power structure in their state. But thirdly, we would say even religious freedoms have now been on the rise in Syria. The idea that Syria has now rehired a lot of school teachers who were previously dismissed, for example, for wearing face veils, and we think that these trends give us an idea that concessions have existed, and we think that the fact that they do exist means that leaders are willing to change, and we think them to make absolute statements by which we think their arguments have been based on are not acceptable. But second, they talk about this idea that their policy will work because the only thing we need to do is take away high-profile leaders and everything will be okay from there. First of all, we really have to question again, and this was a POI I asked, to which we think there was no valid response. Who are the countries that are going to fight this war, and how successful will they be really? Because the military might that they're talking about is the military might of the United States, NATO, EU, maybe even Russia and China, all countries which we think have no vested interest to fight now, but in fact have an interest to veto the particular UN Security Council move to actually allow these wars to begin with. So, what did they say? Turkey has an army. Turkey has 11,800 soldiers, Mr. Speaker. We don't think they have any form of legitimate capacity to do what they did in Libya, for example. We think this is not winning the war by raising countries which have no might in the first place. Next, they say that defectors are going to happen anyway. What we would want to say is that as far as Syria is concerned, we think that there's a lot of rhetoric on the ground, whether it came from the government or people on the ground of an anti-international community one. The idea that they are anti-United States. So, assuming the United States was the one who supported your war, we think they're not going to be okay with that. But assuming the United States is not the one going to be participating in that war, how are they going to win? And we think the wreck of that war is not going to win them any more. But lastly, this idea of refugees, right? They say, well, what they're going to happen is this idea that there's going to be less refugees, and this was a massive assertion. We would say that logically speaking, when you participate in a war, that gives people a massive, great incentive to run away, Mr. Speaker. We think that when violence is less or gradual, or something, Mr. Speaker, that can be prevented by not participating in a rally, we think the incentive for people to run away is going to be much bigger. When wars happen in cities, and even if you didn't want to participate, even if you didn't want to be there, strikes fear in the hearts of people, that is when people are going to run. But what do they say? Turkey has an express incentive to accept these refugees. If this is true, even under our policy, we think that apparently there is an asylum for these people and we think there will be no problem. Last rebuttal. They told us that what their policy will do is that because the military might is there, Russia, China, and Iran will back off. This first of all assumes that the might is going to be stronger than Russia, China, and Iran all combined, which there are very few countries, either Turkey nor Qatar, have that might. But more importantly, who would want to antagonize these countries to begin with? Like the idea of why we want a UN Security Council vote is the idea that we need to respect the notion that many countries are not willing to fight against superpowers like this. When Russia, China, and Iran are not okay with this idea, you have to give us a number of countries who are willing to face these countries even after this war goes on. No, please be seated. What am I going to talk about? What we want to say, Mr. Speaker, is the value of the UN approval. And we think that the UN approval gives us a very good message of an idea that post-construction will indeed happen. Firstly, what we want to compare, and I think that this is the meat of the debate, which we think they have not engaged in, is the difference of the interest of a UN and the difference of the interest of individual nations or coalitions of the willing. What is the calculus of coalitions or individual nations? There are two questions we want to ask. Firstly, Which ones will participate? Which ones have invested natural interest to make sure, for example, that wars in these particular areas are not going to go larger and things like that? What they told us is the issue of refugees. This means that the number of countries that we can really factor in as people who are interested are people who are nearby. And like they said, Turkey and Qatar. We question, what is the incentive of Turkey to participate when they don't want, for example, to send a message of the idea that they want to involve themselves in so many regional issues, given the idea that they want to now participate in the European Union and so on and so forth. As far as Qatar is concerned, we think their military might isn't even strong. As far as the NATO is concerned, we think if you look at Libya, the Libya case study, what we can see is that they didn't even have the might to send soldiers because they didn't have the money, because of the European Union crisis and so on and so forth. But the second question we need to ask is, how far will they go? How far will the coalition of the willing go as far as rebuilding this entire nation is concerned, when their only concern is to remove regional threat? What we would say, Mr. Speaker, to this particular idea is that when there is no more harm to their own nation, they're okay with leaving this particular nation behind. This is ultimately harmful, Mr. Speaker, because even if you can depose the leader, if you have no guarantee that people will invest in making sure the country will have an established government, we think the long-term harm is going to be even so much greater. But let's ask ourselves the calculus of the United Nations. When we ask all countries what their interests will be and whether they're willing to participate, we think that there are a number of ideologies behind it. The idea of rights, Mr. Speaker, the idea that we have a totalitarian perspective to see that we're meshing not only military might to depose leaders, but diplomatic, political, and socio-economic incentives to make sure that these countries re-establish themselves in the long run. If we look at examples like Myanmar, for example, we think that there have been a lot of changes in Myanmar that did not necessarily need military might. And why is this so? We think, Mr. Speaker, that if you look at it, the trends in Myanmar can be credited to the idea that very few countries have tried to meddle in this issue. The ASEAN, for example, is non-interventionist. The less we pressure these leaders to use military might, the less these leaders will need to use might to scare people away. For all these reasons, Mr. Speaker, we think they still have not given us a group of countries which could reasonably win this war, and for all these reasons, we're very proud to oppose it.
I'm sure
It took Myanmar 20 years to allow us any concessions into entering into their country or letting Aung San Suu Kyi. We need side opposition to come and tell us why they're okay with innocent people dying for 20 years and how in those 20 years any sort of diplomacy is going to work. We think it is their burden to show in this debate that their model has a chance of working, that something has changed in status quo aside from eyewash measures which have been given by Assad today. We don't think they've done that. Let's look at 3 questions for this debate. Why intervention will work, why diplomacy won't work, what's the impact of both of these policies. Let's look at why intervention will work, right? Because we told you from the start that military might of NATO, Arab League and Turkey and Qatar combined together are much better than Assad's military might. They even questioned us, does the US and the EU even have any will to go in? We think, why would the US even propose intervening in the Security Council when they didn't have any business going on at all? It isn't there against ground intervention because they want the people of Syria to take ownership of their own country, but ultimately they do want some kind of intervention to take place because they want innocent people to stop dying. It was only Russia and China who was vetoing that in the Security Council, not the US, not the EU. But let's look at that even further, right? Because we think that we recognize that the combined might of these nations are higher than that Assad possesses. So even arms which are given from the US are then enough to go against whatever Assad has. We think that ultimately Turkey and Qatar are then capable of providing whatever ground troops you need, but that's all you need of them, and we don't need them to show that they have that amount of military strength to start with. As long as you have the support of the US and the EU, we think it should be good to them. Go ahead. Ultimately, when they come and oppose it by saying that, look, Syria is an urban center and it's much different from Libya, we think that the US has dealt with urban centers in Iraq and Afghanistan to start with. But ultimately, the difference between Iraq and Afghanistan also is that it was much long drawn over there because show that the conflict is going to end in this kind of a case. The constitutional reforms that came about in Syria allow Assad to be head of state for the next 14 years, and they want that to allow the country. It doesn't allow people who are in exile to come and stand for elections because you need to have had state in Syria for 10 years. We think they need to contest with these kind of tangible changes which Assad has stopped from happening, and they need to show the kind of incentive that Assad has to change. They haven't necessarily done that. Before I move on, I will not be like your previous speaker, I will take a point.
Alright. Tell us, even if there's no outright military conflict, which European nations are going to risk getting energy cut off from Russia? Which nations are going to risk foregoing trade with China?
Okay, it is the EU which has been imposing sanctions in 1979. It is the EU which does not care about the oil, and it's only Russia, China and India which is continuing that kind of oil trade with Syria to begin with. We don't think that EU is that dependent on Syria for oil to begin with. We think that's the entire point of this debate. Let's look at the impact of this kind of situation, because they wanted to come and claim that having a coalition is a bad thing because people from the coalition are suddenly going to leave the country in tatters. We think that the first idea is we don't want the coalition to be the one who sets up the democracy to begin with. We would like the NTC to be the one who takes ownership of that and establish the democracy of their own people. So we don't essentially see the idea of having a coalition around for most of the time. The point why we want a coalition is to ensure that you have enough mind to overthrow Assad, to stop the kind of killings that are going on, and then leave it to the people to begin with. But let's look at post-conflict societies to begin with, because they didn't respond to my previous speaker. Let's reiterate what we told them, because we think that having NDCs being formed is working well in Libya, where you're empowering the people to take ownership of their own societies. But it also entrenches the faith that you have in concepts like democracies when you see the international community stepping up to protect its citizens when millions of citizens are dying on the ground. What did they come and tell you? They told you the opposition is factious. There are many opposition parties over there. But the SNC and the FSA and all other opposition groups want Assad to go, which means there's a common goal with the opposition as well, that they want Assad to be overthrown. What happens after that is up to the people of that country, but we think we need to allow that kind of support to then exist. But they secondly came and told you it's not legitimate because it will be seen like set up by the West or the Arab League. That's not what we wanted. They needed to have heard us clearly. But the last idea of refugees, because the idea of refugees is that it's going to be higher in their side because it's longer conflict under their side. When they come and tell you active war leads to more refugees, under their side people are already fleeing cities because they are military tanks. We think that kind of fleeing is going to stop under our side when you stop those tanks from going into the cities and killing their people. But even if refugees are flowing over, then we think that ultimately countries like Turkey and Qatar are quite okay with doing that. We think there's a moral obligation to save these children, innocent civilians, innocent people. Side opposition doesn't do that. You have to go with prop.
Go, Alan.
You have to wonder if war is as seamless and quick and as painless as affirmative suggests, then why don't we use war as a primary tool to depose dictators?
Here, here.
The reason, ladies and gentlemen, that war is not a primary tool is because the entire proof of affirmative bench has been a lie. War is devastating, war is bloody. So when they said that Assad is killing people now, when we have a war, we're going to have Assad and the coalition killing people. That doesn't sound like a very brilliant situation, and we think, ladies and gentlemen, that this is not an alternative we stand for. Because even if they said that the situation with Assad is very difficult right now, they didn't really prove to us conclusively as to why having the coalition there will make anything better. Because they made all of these generic arguments as to why intervention works, without necessarily providing the nuances of what's happening in Syria right now. And that's precisely the picture that they viewed from the very beginning of his speech. I'm going to show you later why that is the case. There are three clashes in this debate. Firstly, is it possible to win an intervention? Secondly, can we actually have diplomacy and will it work? And thirdly, how important is a UN mandate? What we need to note, ladies and gentlemen, is that when the previous speaker said that it took 28 years for diplomacy to work in Myanmar, firstly, that is a concession that diplomacy works. But secondly, we actually need to compare outcomes. cases, and that the only examples of urban warfare in the recent decade have been Afghanistan and Iran, you need to ask the international community which has actually been a better outcome, Afghanistan and Iran or Myanmar. We think, ladies and gentlemen, if they want to make the case that Afghanistan and Iran and Syria are going to be parallel situations, they need to explain why Afghanistan and Iraq were actually acceptable consequences for the international community. Has even decided that it has been a terrible outcome that shouldn't be repeated anymore in the future. What precisely did they say under this first idea about the possibility to win an intervention? What we heard coming from the first speaker was a very generic argument. He told us firstly there are better weapons, and secondly there are defections. Firstly, if better weapons make interventions work, then we wouldn't have the debacles of Vietnam, Afghanistan, and Iraq. We contend, ladies and gentlemen, that weapons do not determine warfare. That was the argument coming from Job, which we heard no response to. Secondly, we contend, ladies and gentlemen, that defections are not sufficient in the status quo in order to depose the Assad regime. But thirdly, we think that intervention will radicalize people. This was another contention raised by Job, to which we didn't hear any compelling response. Because really, when you have to choose between two people with guns, because you have to realize that both the coalition and both these people who are under Assad will have guns, you need to ask yourself the question, who is easier to vilify? Is it easier to vilify that man who speaks your language, who comes from the same region as you, who probably knows someone who you know, who knows another person? But the point is, ladies and gentlemen, if you compare that to another person who is of white skin, who has a foreign tongue, who you have never seen in your life, who is going to be easier to vilify? We think, ladies and gentlemen, that it's going to be easier to vilify these interventionists, and that's why we believe that if they're backing on defections, their policy of intervention will set back defections. And that's why we believe that their policy of intervention will clearly not work. Moreover, ladies and gentlemen, there is a contention that all of these opposition parties want Assad to go. Okay, brilliant. But the thing is, that's the only thing that they have in common. When you have a lot of opposition groups that have varying interests, precisely about the degrees to which they allow Western intervention, and this was something pointed out by Job, which again, they didn't clash with. We think, ladies and gentlemen, that's where you make the situation even more ripe for sectarian violence. That's where you make the situation even more divisive than it is right now. So we think that the post-war reconstruction that they're forwarding is not something we want. Before I go on.
Shweta told you that we have ground support in Syria, which we never had in Iraq and Afghanistan. Does that not help quickly end the war?
Well, firstly, I do think they had a lot of ground support in Afghanistan and Iraq, given that there were a lot of troops that were involved in that particular thing. But secondly, we think, ladies and gentlemen, that the presence of ground troops just doesn't mean that you're going to instantly win the war, because obviously that's likely to be what happened to Iraq, and they still ended up losing. We think, ladies and gentlemen, this isn't really a battle of numbers. So given all of the things that Job said about how the centers in the conflict in Libya and Syria were massively different, about how there's a fragmented opposition, about how you're going to have a refugee exodus that is going to be instantly unacceptable for many people, and how Job even questioned the willingness of the coalition to actually move forward into this particular plight. We think, ladies and gentlemen, that there's going to be a half-baked effort that will not win anything. Secondly, can we rule out diplomacy with absolute certainty? And the reason why you have to include absolute certainty in this particular regard is because you need to contend that war is a last resort. If they haven't shown us conclusively that diplomacy has failed now and that it will fail for the foreseeable future, then they will lose this debate. And because they haven't proven that diplomacy is shelved. We think, ladies and gentlemen, this was precisely what Peterson gave us in this debate. Peterson told us that there was a rise of market capitalism, where we ended the state of emergency in Syria, and where we even have trends of the Syrian government becoming even more accommodating and becoming even more progressive by rehiring teachers who wanted to wear their veils. To this, we think, ladies and gentlemen, they had no response. But what you need to understand about this situation is that it is an indicator that the Syrian regime is not as close as they would like to suggest. And even if it is as close as they would like to suggest, we've lived with democracy for much longer. And we gave you the example of Myanmar, again, to which we heard no response. Let's take a look at the third idea. How exactly is a UN mandate going to be important? We heard, ladies and gentlemen, coming from them that we cannot wait for UN approval because China would just veto anything and Russia would just veto everything. Firstly, if Russia and China are opposed to this, This highly makes their policy suspect, because which major powers will want to oppose China and Russia? Likely it's only going to be the US, it's going to be the UK. So given all of the fatigue that the US and the UK have been sustaining over the years, and the reason why they went to the United Nations is because they want an intervention that is from the United Nations and that is not just from a particular coalition, because even they realize is that it's going to be extremely difficult if they just go in there alone. We think, ladies and gentlemen, that the only situation which we're going to have are mighty powers who can stand up to Russia and China intervening, and we think, ladies and gentlemen, that it simply isn't going to be sufficient. At the end of this day, you need to ask yourself, have they really proven that diplomacy will fail? We think, ladies and gentlemen, they have not, and moreover, they haven't even proven that war will work with absolute certainty. For all these reasons, we think that now is not the time to go to war. We're extremely proud to oppose.
11 years ago, George W. Bush waged war in Iraq, and this was one of the worst mistakes that we think have happened in recent history. It seems as though it's so easy for us to forget that when you act by yourself or with a group of nations that neither have legitimacy nor actual strength to produce a better state, that this is something that is ultimately harmful and something that we will come to regret. There are a number of things we need to look at in this debate to ask ourselves which side is being more reasonable. The first question that we asked, and I think it was fair to say that we asked this very early, is who will fight the war that you're talking about? I think part of this motion must begs the question that in the event that the UN says no to the war, we must leave it to individual states who are willing to fight the war. We told you a number of reasons why the United States, the EU, and NATO, and all these other major powers, the only powers actually that have the strength to work with the arguments that they themselves have been raising, we told you there's no incentive for them to fight. Who did they say would fight? They said Turkey would fight. They said Qatar would fight. We think these countries, Mr. Speaker, don't have the military might that they've been arguing, and these countries don't have the incentive to do the post-reconstruction that they've been talking about as well. These countries are less equipped than the United States. These countries are the ones that don't want to antagonize the EU. They don't want to antagonize China. So if the United States failed in Iraq, if the United States failed in Afghanistan, why would Turkey and Qatar suddenly become the shining beacon of change in Syria? We think that this type of analysis is sorely lacking from their side, and that's why we think even if they fought the war, they would not have won the war. But what did we tell you why they will not win the war? There are a number of reasons. For one, that there is no unified opposition. For second, Mr. Speaker, the idea that even if you send soldiers there, there's a lot of anti-West rhetoric. That many of these people don't support one particular group, and you will have a lot of people hating these people entering their state anyway. We think, Mr. Speaker, that these types of analysis have been fairly reasonable, but we think there have been not much responses to these arguments. But the last question we have to ask ourselves is this. Can diplomacy work? It's very hard to tell the future, and oftentimes it's very hard to convince people that waiting in itself is a value. You know, it's like love, it's very difficult. But sometimes, Mr. Speaker, the rewards are worth it, because when you fight these wars, there are a lot of costs, especially when you're fighting in urban centers, especially when you're fighting with a weak military force. These are things, Mr. Speaker, that are harmful. But what did we tell you? We told you there were a number of trends that we can see that, in fact, sanctions or diplomacy has worked. The idea that there are now more rights in Syria as far as religious freedoms are concerned, commerce freedoms are concerned, and so on and so forth. We think there's not been a response to these ideas. Because if we look as to why there are concessions, obviously, Mr. Speaker, it's not because of the coalition of the willing, but because diplomacy has worked at the end of the day. There are a number of things we can analyze this debate, and for this final, what we want to tell you, coming from Ateneo, is the idea, Mr. Speaker, that diplomacy sounds like it's something that is hard to swallow, but it is something that is feasible. And we gave you examples like Myanmar. We gave you examples like these countries to show you the idea that it is a long way, but it is a way that is worthwhile. You ask people on the ground if it's worth it, and we think, Mr. Speaker, they would say yes. But what is their response? No, they took a backseat stance and say, we don't care about what people think, we don't care about what's on the ground. The only thing we really really need to know is that if there are enough ground soldiers or what, we're going to win the war regardless of all the costs. We think if you look at this does not respond to the reality on the ground that war is a harmful thing, that war in itself is an evil thing. And if you cannot prove that you're going to win the war, or even if you could win the war but you cannot reconstruct the country, we think it's not a worthy decision. For all these reasons, we're very proud to oppose it.
Ateneo never showed why that policy was ever going to work. And when we asked them, the response was, you can't predict the future. We asked them, ladies and gentlemen, give us one example of where your policy has worked. Their answer was Myanmar. Really? Really, Ateneo? Myanmar, which took 20 years and millions of lives lost, ladies and gentlemen? Do we want that to happen in Syria again, ladies and gentlemen? We don't think we want that to happen. We gave an example of Libya, ladies and gentlemen, where our model worked brilliantly. They had no response to the fact that Libya is doing just okay, ladies and gentlemen. We never once took the burden that war is the primary tool. We said we've tried our primary tools, they have failed. It's high time we went in there and saved some civilian lives. That's the thing in this debate. The first logical question is, should we? And their response to that was extremely underwhelming. We said we have a right to protect people on the ground. No response. We said there's an urgent need to save civilians from this brutal killing, ladies and gentlemen. No response. We told you the trends are alarming. The fact that just yesterday 100 people died in the bombing, ladies and gentlemen, 59 of whom were children. No response, ladies and gentlemen. We think we have to go in, we should go in. The next question then was, will this work? On the first level, ladies and gentlemen, the first question was, are countries willing to intervene? We said yes. Shweta gave you logical analysis, because if US and EU did not want to intervene, why would they propose something like that in the UN, ladies and gentlemen? Why would they have public statements time and time again about the fact that they are eager to go in and save civilians' lives? The next question was, ladies and gentlemen, what will happen on the ground? Because we told you, under our model, ladies and gentlemen, the Free Syrian Army will fight on the ground. They misread our case very badly, ladies and gentlemen, when they said they'll be fighters on the ground. We never once said they'll be fighters on the ground. We argued that the Free Syrian Army will do it. We said we will train them in Turkey, ladies and gentlemen. And that's the difference between Afghanistan and Iraq. There were no locals in Iraq and Afghanistan fighting for us, ladies and gentlemen. There were locals in Libya as opposed to that, ladies and gentlemen. And that was, we think it's very clear on this side of the house. We told you, ladies and gentlemen, people on the ground want intervention. They desperately want help, ladies and gentlemen. The NTC desperately wants help, ladies and gentlemen. No response from that side of the house. We told you defections. Because we analyzed the incentives as to why people fight for Assad. Because they're afraid, ladies and gentlemen. They're afraid for their families. Once again, no response. When we showed, we told you, ladies and gentlemen, that we show these people that once there's a likelihood of success, they will defect, ladies and gentlemen. That's why the Free Syrian Army defected in the first place. Last, ladies and gentlemen, we said in terms of capability, we said we were better. We gave you analysis in Rohit's speech why Russia and China won't give their grade A arms to Syria, ladies and gentlemen. No response to that. We told you in my speech why Russia and China have no incentive to engage in active confrontation with the West, ladies and gentlemen. No response to that either. We think that one stands on our side. The next thing, ladies and gentlemen, is will anything else work? The first question, ladies and gentlemen, and again, I bring this up, they never showed incentives Assad has to give up power, ladies and gentlemen, or stop killing. We, on the other hand, showed you why he has incentives to continue killing people. He has enough money, ladies and gentlemen, in his bank to carry on for a year, where without assistance, this movement will fail, ladies and gentlemen. No response to that. That point also stands. Then they said, what about the trends? Shweta told you in her speech that these are an eye-watch, ladies and gentlemen, that Assad has in fact modified the constitution to keep him in power for another 14 years and effectively precluded any efficient or effective opposition to him, ladies and gentlemen. No response to that either. We think that point also stands. Lastly, about China and Russia, ladies and gentlemen, we told you that these countries cannot afford an active conflict. Once again, no response. Lastly, ladies and gentlemen, what happens post-conflicts? First issue on refugees, we said in status quo, you will have more refugees. Because if your regime bombs you with tanks, you are going to flee your cities and go to every country. And on our side, ladies and gentlemen, there are no tanks involved, there is no air force involved, because we neuter that, ladies and gentlemen, in the initial stages. No response to that either. We said refugees will be less under our paradigm. Last, ladies and gentlemen, in terms of unity, we told you the NTC under our model will reflect the demographics of Syria, ladies and gentlemen. No response to that. We think that will take care of that. We told you, ladies and gentlemen, people on the ground will have ownership of this and will trust the international community because we had timely intervention. No response to that. Ladies and gentlemen, it's been 4 years, but we are finally taking nations back to NTU. Very proud of you.